As we have entered into the second half of session now, Senator, one of the measures I know that you've had a committee hearing on, and I think this is moving closer to some floor time, and that is one that deals with minimum sentencing guidelines.
Yes, as we have seen the Missouri prison population grow, actually the most recent numbers, it has begun somewhat of a decline, which we're really grateful for because we were looking at the possibility of having to build 2 new prisons in Missouri, major expenditures of taxpayer dollars, and it looks like some of the reforms that have already been done are having some effect. But one of the things that was brought to me a couple of years ago was the imposition of mandatory minimum sentences on offenses that really might be hard to explain and justify. One of the catchphrases that some people use is we need to start distinguishing the difference between those people that we really are afraid of and those people that we're just mad at. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but there is a line there that I think most people can acknowledge. There are folks that we really are afraid of, and we really don't want them wandering the streets, choosing what they're going to do on their own. There are other folks that we do think need to be punished, but we don't necessarily think that their punishment ought to go on forever. The attempt was to put some discretion back into the hands of judges. A bill was filed last year. We attempted to amend it into a criminal justice reform bill and had to pull it because we did get some resistance from the prosecutors who saw some things in there that they were concerned about. The bill in the Senate this year has been changed significantly. We've worked with Department of Corrections, with the prosecutors, with the folks that are working to try to get rid of some of the mandatory minimum sentencing, and I think we have a product now that we all believe will help give people a chance to recover from some wrong actions, but also not release people that need to still be behind bars. We're preserving the security of the population, but at the same time we're trying to say, some people really do change, and we need to look at these offenses first of all to say, what does this signify and what's justified? If the bill moves forward and passes, it's Senate Bill 8, there's also a House bill that is very similar, then that bill will significantly affect how the parole board is able to look at each individual offender and make decisions. They've come up with some new techniques that they're using in order to evaluate the threat that an individual offender might bring to the community. The bill essentially gives them a little bit more freedom when they are looking at a potential parolee. It'll send more people to the parole board than are currently going before them, and it'll give them a little more flexibility in terms of what they can do relative to the original sentence. And so I think if we are able to pass it, and there does seem to be a lot of bipartisan support, that it will have an impact, and I think it'll be positive in terms of the criminal justice system.
There are other criminal justice and prison type reform measures out there. One of those is one, Senate Bill 19, that affects sentencing in regards to if someone hurts an emergency responder.
Yes. On the surface, you might say, well, that seems to be a completely counterproductive offer if, in fact, one of the objectives we have here is to get people out of prison who don't need to be in prison with a significant savings to the state as well as an opportunity for those individuals to say, well, we're going to take away even the opportunity for parole for a particular group of citizens. And that's a hard bill to draft. The senator who has that had it up on the floor for, an hour or two just this week, and there are some concerns about it. I've had some discussions with some law enforcement people since then to find out where law enforcement people are, because sometimes someone does a bill on their behalf that they're not necessarily in support of. Senate Bill 19 would essentially remove the opportunity for parole for someone who was guilty of a felony in terms of an assault on a police officer, an emergency responder, or a firefighter. Essentially anybody in public service in uniform. If you punched them or threatened them, you could end up going to jail with no opportunity for parole. That statement itself doesn't adequately explain the whole prosecutorial system and how a prosecutor would look at that and how it would actually be applied. The Department of Corrections had suggested to me that over 2,200 people would be added to our prisons over the next 10 years with the implementation of that bill. But when I talk to people further about exactly how the process works, I think those numbers are a little bit non-representative of what actually would happen. And so there are a lot of subtleties there, but that just illustrates some of the decisions and why some of them are difficult up here. Is on the one hand, we're working to reform criminal justice to bring more people to the parole board so that that board has the opportunity to recognize when it's time to put someone back into the general population and expect a positive performance out of them, versus another bill that threatens to put potentially thousands away from the parole board. And so we'll have to eventually work through that and decide what happens to Senate Bill 19 and what we think its real effect will be, and whether, I guess, the threat of that kind of incarceration will in fact deter people from taking offensive actions against police officers or firefighters or emergency responders. We certainly want to protect those people. I don't always favor creating new special groups, but I don't think anyone would argue that a police officer's job in particular is already dangerous, that any protections that we could try to afford them certainly were worth consideration.
You had a resolution on the floor that's on its way now to the House dealing with how pornography could or should be.
This is a resolution that we passed last year out of the Senate, and there was not a version in the House, and the calendar ran out before the House had an opportunity to consider it. But it simply acknowledges the threat that pornography has already imposed, the dangers that it imposes on our population. It recognizes that children are being exposed to pornography now at elementary school ages, and the changes that it makes not only in their brain functions, but in their thinking towards the relationships between men and women. And there's just a lot of harmful effects of pornography. The resolution essentially just says these are the impacts that pornography is having on society, and we recognize that we need to take this more seriously, and we need to look for ways that we can help mitigate that. There's also a Senate bill that attempts to address that in terms of putting some kind of filtering on electronic devices for children. One of the bills that has been submitted would put a filter on every device initially, and then would equip the parents with the necessary password or access so that a parent could remove that filter. But that parent could know that apart from their intervention, that there would at least be some filtering. The technology involved in that is pretty challenging. There's a lot of work being done to try to figure out whether that can be done and how it would be done, how it would be paid for. I think the resolution just simply says this has enough negative impacts on society that we in the legislature need to take it seriously, and Missourians need to be looking for solutions.
7 weeks left in session, among those obviously the budget, but still just under 2 months now. Seems like a fairly long time, but legislatively, not so much.
Not so much. That's exactly right. The budget will be the big thing, and as soon as we have that, our Appropriations Committee will do its work, and then it'll be brought to the Senate. And sometimes once the Appropriations Committee is finished with it, it goes fairly quickly on the Senate floor. Other times it takes a while. But you're right. As we watch that calendar and see hundreds of bills lining up, we know that a lot of them will not see the light of day unless they end up piled on another bill. That's how we end up with these omnibus bills that I think both public and legislatures hate, but we do that because it's the only chance to pass a particular measure. The floor time becomes very critical. Yesterday, we spent time on, I think, 3 different bills, none of which had reached a perfection vote. They were laid over after several hours of debate. Then we went to some other bills that were not too controversial, and we're able to perfect a few of those bills. But we'll eventually go back to some of those more difficult bills, and that takes time, and every hour that's consumed is 1 hour less that people have to bring up their legislation and pass it.